Book talk to the front.
So, would I recommend this book? Absolutely not.
Hey girlfriend. This video is really my thoughts on A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. No one asked for it, but I'm finding it hard to go about my daily life without sharing my thoughts. Book talk to the front. Book talk to the front. I blame this on y'all. I read A Little Life out of pure curiosity and I regret it. And the reason I regret it is because as much as the internet talks about this book, I wasn't prepared for it. So I'm going to be a good citizen of the internet and prepare you for reading this book by just giving you the truthful rundown, because the way this book is talked about on the internet is useless. Before I drag this book, let me give you a synopsis of it, and there lies my first problem, because I feel like we don't even get the synopsis right. This book is not about four college friends and how their friendship evolves over adulthood. This book is about Jude St. Francis and his traumatic childhood and how he comes to terms with that, and how the people around him come to terms with Jude coming to terms with his trauma. The book is literally centered on trauma and the fact that I feel like people are trying to flip it and be like, but it's about friendship. That's a catfish. I also have an issue with people being like, here are the trigger warnings for this book. In most cases, like, yes, do that. But this is a book where if you need trigger warnings, just don't read it. I read this book now over a month-ish ago, and I still slip into moments of extreme sadness when I just randomly think about it. Where I have an issue with all of this is that we say this book is so emotionally traumatizing, but Hanya Yanagihara is a really good writer. Her writing is so powerful. The book is emotionally draining because the writing is really good. The way Hanya writes is truly, it is advanced, but the mechanisms she uses is like what makes this book an emotional roller coaster. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. Are there going to be spoilers? I'm not going to try not, but I'm going to be talking about her writing style and the structure of the book. So if that's going to spoil it for you, I guess click away. But then again, I don't recommend this book, so even if I do spoil it, it's better you listening to me spoil it than actually reading the book. So this book is written in third person, the third person omnipresent. I think that's what it's called. In doing this, Hanya kind of takes the reader for a whirlwind because the story is not linear, which isn't unique. She didn't invent the structure of not telling a story in chronological order. You are only introduced to a character enough to know context for like the immediate scene that they are being attached to. That is always related to Jude, because again, this book is about Jude and his trauma. And that's what makes the book so emotionally exhausting, is because you're in a third person, but there's also a lot of different points of view. So each of the four friends, Malcolm, JB, Jude, and Willem, they all kind of have their own like POV section. You get into their heads on how they think, their past experiences, their relationship with Jude. You really kind of just become the voice in their head. And then Hanya like sucks you out and puts you in another person's head. I don't know what the literary term is, where it's like the audience knows something that the characters don't know, or two characters know something that the audience doesn't know. It's all of that happening at once. And kind of like the mystery of the book is what happened to Jude in his childhood. And you slowly start to learn about it. But again, Jude is kind of presented as this unreliable narrator because he is mentally ill. I will talk about that in a second. I'm going to revise that statement and say, not that Jude is an unreliable narrator, but he is so reserved that when he does share his story, you're still kind of left wondering, is that it? So that's what I meant. This is basically what I'm trying to say. Because this book is written in third person and you know each person's past thought process to the extent that Hanya wants you to know it, every interaction, each person acts rationally. You know what motivates each character, and you know what scares Jude again, and you know what is about to trigger Jude before it actually happens. This book is a lot of anxiety, because not that you know what's going to happen, but you know the type of response that you're going to get from certain characters if they are presented with certain decisions. And even if you don't know what they're going to do, you know how it's going to be interpreted by Jude, and you know that doesn't end well, because the purpose of the book is that Jude doesn't get better.
So I was reluctant to start, in a sense, because there are many different possibilities of who Jude could have been, but I knew at the heart he would be someone who fundamentally never improved.
I guess if you needed a trigger warning, mental illness is a very centered thing here. And the way that it's presented is a little bit different than what I've seen in other books. One, because the protagonists are grown men. They're full adults in their 30s, 40s. So their relationship with mental health and mental illness is not the same as something you're going to read in like The Bell Jar or My Year of Rest and Relaxation, also because those books are about young women. But what I'm saying is that you see a very rational side of mental illness, of the side of Jude that knows this makes no sense, I shouldn't be doing this, and the side of him that can't stop. And what makes it worse is that Jude is very intelligent, he's very successful, he is fairly well off. So there are these generally accepted things, at least in American life, that he has that people can point to and say like, oh, but look, he's successful, even though he is quite literally falling apart from the inside, which is a theme I do appreciate because I do think it's relevant. That's what I think makes this conversation about mental health and Jude a little bit more taxing, is because you can relate to it. And another reason you can relate to it is because this book doesn't really have a time period. Like, you could have told me this book was written about, well, there are cars, so it does have to be after the car was invented. It's timeless, is what I'm saying. It's easy to get attached to characters because you know that they're adults and you know that they're growing older and moving through life, but you don't have like a specific time period to attach it to. This book has a very distinct undertone, and I'm not really sure how to describe it, but it's that feeling of everybody knows, right? Like, everyone is kind of watching this dumpster fire, and they know how they could stop it, and they know how they could intervene, but they don't, for one reason or another that you learn throughout the book. And for the most part, there is no one character in this book that is 100% right, 100% wrong. Everyone is flawed, but you know that they're acting in a rational way, in a way that they genuinely think is helping Jude or the situation at hand, with the exception of like 2 or 3 characters that are just objectively terrible. Even the flawed characters have a specific goal and a specific way of internalizing Jude and his life to where they act, where they genuinely do believe that they're doing the right thing with the amount of knowledge that they know. And then obviously another important part of the book is, what knowledge do they know? When do they find out? How do they find out? You are reading this book. When you read this book, you do kind of have this hindsight guilt and hindsight kind of interpretation of it, because you can very much pinpoint areas in the book where, like, if you had done this instead of this wouldn't have happened. But again, because no character is fully right or fully wrong, they were either misinformed by their own fault or someone else's. It's just like quite taxing because you know all the ingredients. This book is 720 pages. I can confidently say I think at least 450 of them were just consistent sadness. There might be a part of the book that is just significantly less depressing than something you just read, and so you kind of are like, okay, things are chilling, even though objectively they're not. But the way in which you move from like trauma to backstory to trauma to backstory to someone's rationing and how they reacted to it in trauma, and what, like, everything is just revolved around trauma. There's no one character, no one event that exists independently of Jude and his trauma and how it affects Jude and his trauma. And I think because this book is long and because people are emotionally connected to it, they want to give it all of these accolades, which Hanya Yanagihara says on record that she wrote this book not to be a commentary on some greater issues happening in the world. The story exists in the pages only. It's not meant to be taken out of context. So I don't like that people have referred to this as like the next great gay novel. There are topics and discussions of sexuality, but I would kind of argue that that's not really the point of the book. The characters don't really think about their sexuality as part of their identity, even really, honestly. It's hard to say that they are doing things because they are purely motivated by their sexual orientation. It just is. Like, I just genuinely feel like in this book is just accepted as a fact, and it's not really questioned until later in a very specific scene, which if that's the context we're talking about, fine. But when we start bringing in characters for gay representation, that's problematic. I just don't think this is the representation the LGBTQ community was asking for, because these are not good characters. The story isn't about their sexuality and they're coming to terms with it. It's literally just terrible people that so happen to not be straight. I say they're flawed, not because they're unlikable. They are terrible people, they are criminals, and they are assailants. And if that's the narrative we're gonna push for the LGBTQ community, I don't like that. I just don't like it. I'm back. I had to take a short intermission because I need a job. And yeah, this is not the next great gay novel. Sexuality is not the main point of this story, and when it is talked about, it's not really being questioned. It's more so being explored. I don't know. I'm a straight woman, but I kind of got the sense that sexuality in this book wasn't really being questioned. Characters that were gay just were. It wasn't like they were too insecure about it. I think they embraced it actually pretty. I might get canceled for this. But I felt like romantic initiatives, romantic decisions in this book were not made in the name of questioning sexuality or exploring sexuality, with the exception of one. Another thing I want to talk about for this book: gatekeeping. I am pro gatekeeping reader access to A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara, because not everybody needs to read it. Call me irrational. You do things because the benefit is greater than whatever loss you would have. I can't say that it's worth the headache and sadness. I get people want a book that will make them feel something. You might want a book that makes you cry. There are a lot of other books. This is my mom. All for gatekeeping people from reading this book, because it's just not necessary. You don't need to. If you want to cry, there are a lot of other books you can read. There's not a single review online that doesn't say that this book isn't super emotional or super taxing, and you should be very intentional if you're going to read this book. I agree. If it was up to me, I'd tell you not to read it, but I am not the true gatekeeper of literature here, so if you are going to read it, be very intentional about it. I put the book down for 10 days when I was reading it just because I couldn't handle it. I read something and it says you get uncomfortably close to Jude, and that is true. The proximity you have to Jude and his current self, his past self, is kind of unnerving. It's disturbing, to say the least, because it does get worse. I know people say, oh, it gets better, and you read the book hoping that it gets better, but it doesn't. And part of the reason you get so uncomfortably close to Jude is because Hanya Yanagihara was an editor for a magazine. Let me check my notes. She was an editor when she's writing this book. She was also working full-time when she was writing this book. And you feel that. You get this analytical sense. She does a really good job at making you anticipate things, suspense, emotion. Obviously, that's the entire premise of this video. And the reason is because as specific and purpose... Not my roommate singing. kind of ambiguous as the setting is, all you really know is that it's in New York City and certain places in Massachusetts. I could have just made that up. I think it is Massachusetts though. The time period is very ambiguous. Jude's race is ambiguous, but alas, when they did the theater production, he was white. I found it very hard to tell myself Jude's not a real person and this is not a memoir. Like, this genuinely reads like a memoir kind of, and that's also what makes it very hard, is because for all intents and purposes this is a true story, and reading it you kind of know that even if not all of these events happen to one person, you know that all of these events have happened to someone. They're not that far-fetched, although they might be over-exaggerated in some points. You know, fundamentally, like, these are real traumatic issues that happen in the world. Jude's a fictional character. Willem's a fictional character. These are fictional characters, but they're really not. While the events themselves are tragic, that's not what makes the book unrecommendable. What makes the book unrecommendable is, again, the kind of uncomfortable emotional proximity you get to people, because you're not just seeing this event happen in the third person and then you move on. Like, no, when you're given an event, you are shown how the character thinks, how it's processing, and from a lot of different angles. Someone dying isn't sad. It is sad, but what makes someone dying very, very, very sad is because you have to continue life after. You have to process that. And that's not a fun thing to process. So for you to have to process trauma page after page after page after page after page, it's exhausting. The reason this book is hard to read is because it's emotionally taxing, not because the events are sad. And that's the distinction I want to make very clear. Not sad because sad things happen. It's sad because you are unable to get out of the minds of a mentally ill person or persons while they are processing something that is traumatic and objectively terrible. I just don't think the trauma you are going to incur from reading this book is worth it. I guess if you want to read it, read it. I tried. I told you not to, but that's kind of like my take on this book. I don't know. Reinstate gatekeeping. If you're under 18, don't read this book. TikTok is lying to you. Book Talk, and a lot of people are reading this book and they are talking about it, which is kind of the point of reading. So I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying I wish this conversation was a bit more transparent and we were a little bit more... I don't really have anything else to say. That's just my opinion. I think it's correct. All right, I'll see you next time I have something to say.